Recording. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for our Win for Supportive Housing Learning Community. My name is um, Emily Bands. I'm joined by my colleague here, Dawn Reinhardt, and we are going to be facilitating a presentation on an introduction to using acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, strategies in supportive housing. So our typical welcome, we just want to shout out that today's webinar is hosted by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. Excuse me, this is going to be an interactive training, and we encourage you to ask questions and participate throughout the session. The slides, as well as the link to the recording of the webinar, will be sent by email after the presentation. I also just want to advise a note about artificial intelligence, or AI. So please note that the use of automated note-taking bots or similar tools during any Washington FCS event or meeting requires prior approval. Unauthorized use of such tools is prohibited to ensure the privacy and confidentiality of all attendees. Also, any recording that is created through AI is not recognized as an official recording of this session. We reserve the right to exit trainees from the training if they are using AI to take notes without prior approval or using AI to record the session. If you do have any additional questions regarding that, please reach out to the Washington State Healthcare Authority because this messaging is specifically from them. So in terms of just general housekeeping for our training, just know that your audio and video are currently muted. We are in webinar mode in Zoom, meaning that you do not have the ability to unmute yourself or turn on your video. However, if I am asking a question, or you have a question and you would feel more comfortable unmuting yourself to ask that question, what I can do is I can just unmute you. So you can just raise your hand, press the raise your hand button, and that's how I'll know to unmute you. And then you can ask that question. So you do have the ability to do that. If you are not connected to audio, though, please make sure to connect and call in to ensure that you're able to hear me and listen to the presentation. So to ask or respond to questions, you can use the chat. It's not panelists and attendees, it's actually everyone. So you want to click on everyone, and that will ensure that your question goes to everybody. If it is, I guess, something private that you don't want shared with the group, you can also just ask the host and panelists, and that'll just go to myself and Dawn. You can also download the chat by clicking on the three buttons next to the smiley face in your chat box. If there's any information that from the chat that you feel like you'd like to save at the end of the webinar or at the end of the meeting, you can save the chat. There are no certificates of attendance, so ignore that. And then in terms of accessibility, subtitles are available. To see subtitles, click on captions, and I did enable the captions. And then just know that the presentation is being recorded. And as I stated before, the presentation and recording is going to be shared. So let's get into our learning objectives. So what we're really going to focus on today is recognizing the history and research behind ACT. And I do just want to put a disclaimer out there that acceptance and commitment therapy is, it sounds like ACT. That's how you're supposed to say it. I know with DBT and CBT, you say the letters, but according to Stephen Hayes, who is the creator of ACT, it is pronounced ACT. So we're going to recognize the history and research behind ACT. I'm going to describe psychological flexibility and its role in ACT. And psychological flexibility is really one of the main concepts within ACT and understanding it. And then we're going to review some ACT techniques that are applicable to service provision in supportive housing settings.
Hey, Emily, I just wanted to jump on real quick because I'm not sure this is in this, but I know that some people may also be familiar with ACT as in assertive community treatment. And I think that's why the distinction. So I just wanted to make sure folks, knew that we weren't talking about that either.
That's a really good point, Dawn. So yes,
Out of it.
as Dawn said, we're not talking about assertive community treatment. We are talking about acceptance and commitment therapy, which is something that was developed by Stephen C. Hayes. So thank you, Dawn. So this is Dr. Stephen C. Hayes, and I did want to do a little shout out to him as the developer of this therapeutic modality. Um, he started his work in developing a new behavioral science approach called contextual behavioral science, which then sort of sprung into this idea of functional contextualism, which is more of a philosophical science. That then kind of evolved into a basic science of human higher cognition, which is relational frame theory or RFT. And then that actually then evolved into an application to individual psychological change, which is acceptance and commitment therapy or training or ACT. Dr. Hayes has published 47 books. He's participated in nearly 700 scientific articles published on ACT. And he's one of the most cited psychologists in the world as he continues to innovate in the field of psychology. He loves to talk about ACT. So if after this training or after our meeting today, if you are interested in learning more about ACT, you can go on his website, which I'm going to show you, or which kind of links to any resources that he has, as well as all the times he's kind of spoken about it. So I think he's done TED Talks, he's been on podcasts. I've listened to a couple of the podcasts he's been on. He loves to share ACT. Like I said, he has 47 books that he's published related to ACT. So this is somebody who loves to share this information. Mariah, I see your hand is raised. Did you want me to unmute you? No. Okay. Awesome. No, no problem. No problem. So this is a therapeutic modality that is very well studied. It's something that has a lot of research behind it, which I'm going to talk about in a later slide. But I did just want to quickly shout Dr. Stephen Hayes out and also just let you know I am going to be sharing some additional resources, specifically his website at the end of the presentation. So what is ACT? So ACT was developed in the 80s by Dr. Hayes, and it focuses on the human experience and really understanding that the human experience is hard. Okay, it's difficult. We all understand that. It's a shared difficult experience, but it is a hard human experience that we have. So even though ACT is technically a therapy, it is something that people can work on individually. There are a lot of self-help books out there related to ACT. ACT, in terms of acceptance and commitment training, is also something that is used in other disciplines like sports or business as a training modality. So one of the other I think cool things about ACT is that it is really flexible in its use. So it can be used in more of a one-on-one individual therapy type setting, but it can also be used around training. And then what makes it useful in supportive housing settings is there are a lot of really good skills that you as supportive housing workers working in FCS can teach some of any of the individuals really that you're working with, similar to kind of CBT techniques or DBT techniques. ACT really emphasizes mindfulness, acceptance, and values as a way to build mental strength and resilience to increase something called psychological flexibility. I'm going to talk a little bit more about psychological flexibility at a later slide, but I do want to explore a little bit about mindfulness, acceptance, and values and what they mean in ACT. I'm sure we all know what mindfulness, acceptance, and values mean in a general sense, but ACT focuses on defining these in a way that's very specific to this modality. So when we're thinking about mindfulness, mindfulness is a way of observing your experience, okay? Because again, ACT really focuses on this concept of understanding that the human experience is hard, right? So ACT wants to maximize human potential to help the person that you're working with to create a meaningful life for themselves while learning how to deal with the pain that life causes. So mindfulness is a way of observing the experience that we have. The thoughts that we have are essentially the lens which we view the world, and ACT encourages you to change and shift the way you view your life from either the past and what happened in the past or the future into the present. So we're really making this shift of focusing on things that happened in the past, or really being focused on what our life is going to be or look like in the future, to really focusing on what is happening right now in this moment. In terms of acceptance, an ACT when you experience pain and you try to remove it from your life, ACT theorizes that trying to remove the pain actually amplifies it and makes it bigger. There's this feeling of the pain consuming you. In ACT, and thinking about acceptance or willingness, it focuses on your feelings and your thoughts, regardless of whether or not what you are feeling or thinking is painful. So it's really shifting your focus on kind of your thoughts away from the feeling aspect of it. Okay. Actually encourages people to feel and think what comes to them, right? You're essentially taking the good with the bad and accepting that what is happening is a part of life and the bigger picture of your life. So it's acceptance, right? It is what it is, what I'm currently feeling, what I'm currently experiencing. It's not bad or not good. It's just what it is. And then values in ACT really focuses on the idea of commitment. So essentially in ACT, we're using our values to commit to action within our lives. So in kind of preparation for this webinar, I listened to a few podcasts about where Dr. Hayes had spoken, because again, this man loves to talk about ACT, which I think makes a lot of sense, right? He's devoted his life to this modality. And he is so happy to share ACT and kind of what it stands for and what it's about to other people. So he's done a lot of podcasts on this. So I was listening to a podcast from 2021. It's called Being Well. And he spoke about his wedding ring as almost the physical representation of his values of commitment and love to his wife. And he talked about how every morning when he wakes up, he notices his wedding ring. And he said he will even sometimes hold it in his hand and intentionally think about the values he holds that are related to that ring. Excuse me. And then he lives his life exemplifying those values by remaining committed to his wife, right? So he's waking up in the morning, he notices his wedding ring, and he takes this moment to really be mindful, right? He holds it in his hand. He is intentional in what he's thinking about in terms of what this wedding ring actually means to him and what it stands for. And it is a physical symbol of his love and his commitment to his wife and how important that is in his actual life. And I wanted to share this example because when he was describing it, and I'm sure I didn't do it justice, but when he was describing it, I thought it was a really good example of how values are used to inform actions in ACT, right? His value is commitment, and he has this physical symbol. And now he's, not to be like crude, but essentially he's not going out and cheating on his wife when he leaves the house, right? He has this physical symbol of his marriage to his wife, and he's using that to inform how he is going to show his love and commitment to her, whether that be buying her flowers or buying her maybe, a gift that she likes, or watching a show with her or spending time with her in whatever way. So that is how values are a sort of um, a way to influence and motivate behavior in this umbrella of ACT. So before I go into the research, I just want to ask, does anybody have any questions about anything that I said? Okay. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts or comments, please feel free to stop. And I say that because I am a CBT girly. I am very much committed to cognitive behavioral therapy. So for me, understanding ACT has been a adventure. I'm not going to say it was challenging or difficult. There are definitely some things I do relate to. There's definitely some things I don't relate to. But there were some things as I was developing this presentation that I was like, I'm not 100% sure about this. And then I had to do a little bit more reading and a little bit more research. So if there is anything you don't understand, please feel free to ask and I'll try to give you an answer. Um, so Alyssa, you said you have one question. Could you speak more about how mindfulness and shifting your perspective are related? Um, yes. So when from the lens of ACT, mindfulness again is being in the present moment. So if we think about um, some of the typical things that I think can occur for some of the individuals that we're working with. And let me know if this is something any of you have experienced, right? I had I won't say a lot, but I definitely had consumers who I was working with in supportive housing who were maybe very focused on things that had happened to them in the past, or maybe very focused on things that they were kind of worried about or concerned about for the future. Has that kind of happened to anybody? Does that sound like any of the individuals that you're working with? I want to make sure the example I'm giving is relatable. So just give me a yes in the chat box if that makes sense. All right, cool. So essentially, when our thoughts and our fears and our worries are kind of focused on things that are happening in the past and things that are happening in the future, you're sort of ignoring what's happening in the present moment. So, what ACT wants you to do essentially is focus on the present in order to find meaning in your life right now. So we're kind of shifting away from the worries, the fears of the past and the worries and fears related to the future. And we're focusing on what we can do in this moment to make our life meaningful, to, explore our values, to strengthen our values. Does that kind of, does that answer your question, Alyssa? Okay, cool. Awesome. All right. So thinking about the research, um, ACT is very, very well researched. ACT is probably, um, actually, I'm going to take that back because I don't know if it is the most well researched modality, but it has a lot of research. And Stephen Hayes is actually focused on research and trying to show how effective ACT is. So this specific information I'm going to give you is from a meta-analysis that was done on ACT from 2024. So like I said, he's definitely worked very diligently to try to develop studies to show the evidence behind ACT. When we're looking at the information I'm going to give you, it's compared to it's compared to treatment as usual, and showing that acts in these instances were more effective than treatment as usual. Additionally, some of the studies were also shown to have outcomes that were similar to people using CBT. So there were 55 randomized controlled trials that showed that ACT was effective in treating depression. There were 12 done for anxiety and anxiety disorders. There were 20 randomized controlled trials for OCD. ACT for psychosis has been found to reduce positive and negative symptoms, affective symptoms, and rehospitalization. And then there were 33 randomized control trials that found that ACT helped with physical functioning, pain intensity, and reducing depression and anxiety, and including quality of life. In addition, there were 55 randomized control trials that focused on a majority individuals with cancer. There were 35 people who had cancer, 9 people with diabetes, individuals who are considered quote unquote overweight. There were 4 people in the study, 3 people who had had a stroke, 2 people who had a diagnosis of coronary heart disease, 2 people with epilepsy, 1 person with asthma, and 1 person with arthritis. And in that study, ACT was found to help with the quality of life and symptom improvement of those physical health diagnoses. So ACT has shown to be effective. I do have the citation for the meta-analysis at the end of the slide. So you're welcome to kind of read the article and get more information there. But again, I just wanted to bring home the point that this is something that is well researched, that does have evidence to support its use. And I definitely think it's something that could be used in supportive housing settings, because I'm sure that some of the people you're working with have a diagnosis of depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, potentially psychosis, as well as maybe even some of these physical health conditions that I mentioned. So before I get into ACT and what it is, I did want to just show what ACT is in relation to CBT and DBT, because there are some overlaps between both of these. Okay. And also pointing out that CBT was essentially first. And DBT and ACT sort of sprung from this idea of CBT. So in thinking about CBT, we're exploring thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. DBT is really emphasizing validation and acceptance of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And then in ACT, thoughts and feelings are normal and not unhealthy. And there's this emphasis on mindfulness, acceptance, and values. And that's really what sort of shifts in ACT compared to DBT and CBT, because ACT is really focusing on shifting the way the person views the world and really looking at normalizing the human experience, including human pain, and what ACT specifically refers to as human suffering. So CBT and DBT, CBT kind of focuses on shifting the thoughts and the behaviors and the feelings, right? And kind of noticing that connection. DBT is really focusing on accepting them, but ACT kind of takes it out a little bit more global and focuses more on how we're viewing the world, whereas CBT and DBT kind of focus and hone in on the emotions, the thoughts, the feelings, the behaviors. Okay, so I hope that that explanation makes sense. So ACT really focuses on this idea of psychological flexibility. But before I talk about that, I wanted to give a brief overview of what psychological inflexibility is and what it looks like. So I forget what this is called. It's like the ACT, like octagon or something like that. It has a cool name. I'd have to, I'm disappointed in myself for forgetting what it is. But this is what psychological inflexibility looks like in a person. So psychological inflexibility is basically the rigidity and way we view ourselves, our thoughts, our behaviors, our emotions, and the world. And yes, Cameron, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint. So if we look here to dominance of conceptualized past and feared future and weak self-knowledge, this is really referring to someone who is stuck in the past or too focused on the future and ignoring the present. Lack of values clarity, dominance of plans and avoidant tracking is this idea that when we don't have values, we essentially don't have a guide for how we desire to live our lives or act or behave, which can then leave us feeling directionless or avoidant. Inaction, impulsivity, or avoidant persistence looks at behaviors that are not in alignment with mindfulness or living in the present moment, which then leads to this idea of inaction, impulsivity, or avoidant persistence. Attachment to the conceptualized self focuses on this idea that we all create a picture of who we are, but that picture is made based on our perception of us or using subjective and objective information. And what can happen is we can become stuck on this picture of ourselves, especially if it's a negative picture of ourselves. Cognitive fusion is this idea that we're stuck in our thoughts, mostly negative thoughts like, excuse me, I'm a failure or I'm not capable. And our thinking is rigid and focused only on the thought. And then experiential avoidance is when we avoid unpleasant thoughts, emotions, and experiences. Okay. So, this is what psychological inflexibility looks like. And what I'm going to show you now is what psychological flexibility is. So, I'm not going to try to play it in the PowerPoint because actually, maybe I'll try to play it on the PowerPoint and see if this works.
Acceptance and commitment therapy aims to increase psychological
I hope you all can
flexibility.
hear this.
And psychological flexibility is defined as the capacity to contact the present moment while also being aware of thoughts and emotions without trying to change those private experiences or be adversely controlled by them. And depending upon the situation, persisting in behaviors or changing behaviors in the pursuit of chosen values. Now, that last clause in the definition of psychological flexibility can be somewhat confusing. Psychological flexibility calls on people to sometimes persist and sometimes to change. Which is it? Well, acceptance and commitment therapy is a very contextual approach. It all depends on the person's values and on the situation. Perhaps a simpler way to understand psychological flexibility is to invoke the metaphor of a hockey goalie. Now, I know hockey's not all that popular of a sport around the world, but hopefully you know a little bit about ice hockey. One of my favorite parts of the game is before it actually starts. All the players are getting ready, warmed up to play the game, and all the players are out there skating around in circles taking shots on the open net. Why is the net open during warm-ups? Well, because the hockey goalie is still on the sidelines pulling on his bigger leg pads than everybody else wears. He's got a bigger helmet and he's got a bigger stick, so it takes him a little while to lumber out there. But these big players, usually about 200 pounds or more, over 6 feet tall, they're getting limbered up for the game too. These big players all of a sudden will just drop down into the splits. It's pretty remarkable. And then, because they're on ice skates, they'll scrape themselves back up into a standing position. And then maybe they'll stretch out by kicking one leg out. They get up again, kick the other leg out. And they show off just how flexible they are. Why? Because in the middle of the game, if someone takes a shot on them, they might actually have to do the splits. And then the puck bounces off their leg pad and it's still in play. So someone else takes another shot and the player's got to lift his stick up to the left-hand side of the goal. And it deflects off the stick and it's still in play. And then maybe another opponent takes a shot on them and they grab it with their mitt from the right side of the goal. The whistle blows. The play is over. But this hockey goalie is splayed out all over the ice. He's stretched himself this way and that way, showing off his flexibility. And we might go up to that goalie and say, why do you change your behavior so readily? Why do you change your posture so much? And he might say, it's in the service of my chosen values, eh? He's trying to say that there are certain things that he cares about that makes him change his posture in such amazing ways. We might ask him, then what are your values? And he might say, sportsmanship, athleticism, the camaraderie with my teammates. As a professional athlete, I provide for my children and my spouse this way. Those are things that are meaningful to me, and they motivate me to change my posture so much, even when it's difficult. And other times, the puck is on the other side of the rink, and the goalie is in front of his goal all by himself. But out of nowhere, there's a breakaway. All of a sudden, the other team starts skating towards him, passing the puck back and forth to each other. They're moving really fast, and they pass the halfway line. They keep passing the puck back and forth to each other, going past the defenders, and all of a sudden, it's just the goalie and the other team. One of them goes ahead and takes that slap shot. And this puck, which is made of rubber but hard as a rock and sometimes gets clocked at moving 80 miles an hour, this missile is flying right at the goalie. The impending pain is coming. If we were in this goalie's skates, we'd see that missile flying at us and we'd say, I'm out of here. And we jump out of the way because we don't want to feel the pain. But not this goalie, not this flexible goalie. He sees this flying missile coming right at him and he says, I'm not moving. I'm staying right here. I'm going to persist. And then boom, right to the chest. The puck hits him and he feels the pain. He stays where he is, doesn't get out of the way, and has to feel pain because of it. And we might go up to the goalie at that point and say, why didn't you get out of the way? You're athletic enough to avoid this. And he might say, I persisted in the service of my chosen values. I care about sportsmanship. I care about athleticism. I care about the camaraderie with my teammates and providing for my family. Things that are important to me influence me to stick to it, even if it's difficult. The hockey goalie metaphor gives us a solid understanding of what psychological flexibility is all about. Sometimes you persist in your actions, and sometimes you change your actions. It all depends on the context and your values.
So the reason why I chose this specific video is because I really liked this metaphor. This metaphor really resonated with me. I think when I was trying to understand what psychological flexibility is, I was having a lot of trouble trying to figure out how to explain it to all of you. So this metaphor, I think, really drives down the two important parts of psychological flexibility, right? This idea of persistence and this idea of changing. And as he said at the end of the video, right, when we're thinking about persisting, depending on the context, right, it's the person staying in place essentially and taking that pain or taking that potentially negative experience, right? Because they know that it's going to support their values and almost like their end goal, right? So one of the things he was talking about in the video was sportsmanship, but I would also imagine that the goalie wants to win the game, right? And they're not going to win the game if the other team is scoring on them, right? So essentially, he's taking this hit from that hockey puck to ensure that the team is going to win the game. And then this aspect of change, right? The goalie is moving around, they're doing somersaults, they're doing splits, he's doing all these different things, right? Again, to try to block the puck to ensure that they're going to kind of reach that end goal. And yeah, absolutely, Christy, right? You're using your values, you're using maybe mindfulness strategies, right? You're using acceptance, right? So in that moment, in that persistence, he essentially had to accept, like, this is going to hurt. What is going to happen next is probably going to hurt me. This puck is going to hurt me, but I'm going to persist. So you're using those values, you're using that acceptance, you're using that mindfulness in order to promote that flexibility in thinking. And I think this is also very much in alignment with the idea that an act, and this is something that I think has been, I think that what I'm about to say, I understand that it can be, I'll say, a little radical. And this is coming from ACT and kind of this theory. So ACT really accepts the concept that life is challenging and it's difficult and it's painful sometimes, and bad things essentially happen to us, but we accept them and kind of stay in that moment and be present in that moment and continue to let our values drive our behavior. Now, I know that that could feel a little radical in thinking about trauma, and thinking about any individuals who you've worked with who are maybe have experienced trauma, or if trauma is kind of coming up. How to, obviously we're not telling any of the individuals we're working with to just accept their trauma and this terrible thing that happened to them. And that's why ACT might not be for everybody. And that's okay. But that is part of what psychological flexibility is, and what ACT really focuses on. So in getting a little more in depth into what psychological flexibility is, and what I will say is, and this will be easier to kind of compare when you have the PowerPoint, but each one of these little concepts is sort of the reverse, right? So for over here, we have acceptance. When someone is psychologically flexible, they have acceptance. And when someone is experiencing psychological inflexibility, they're experiencing experiential avoidance. Okay, so just kind of making that comparison. So in order to attain psychological flexibility, this is what we're looking for. So we're looking for cognitive diffusion, right? So in cognitive diffusion, your thoughts are viewed as separate. Viewing thoughts as an internal phenomena and behavioral process as opposed to a truth. It really looks at the thoughts instead of looking from the thoughts. And diffusion, I will say, is one of the more confusing concepts in ACT, because it really has this sort of like outer space view of thinking, right? You're literally, I envision myself like being in outer space and looking at the earth, and the earth is essentially my thoughts, and I am looking at my thoughts as opposed to being on earth and looking to space toward my thoughts, if that kind of makes sense. It's really this sort of higher view of thinking, and it can be very challenging for people to achieve this. But essentially, it's this noticing, it's this concept of noticing the process of thinking in addition to the product of thinking. When we're looking at acceptance, we're actively embracing thoughts and feelings and sensations, even if they are uncomfortable. And in ACT, acceptance is intentional and it's powerful. In terms of contact with the present moment, that's being in the here and now. It's getting out of your head and being actively present in what is happening in the moment and in the here and now. And this is probably most related to mindfulness. Self as context is observing the transcendent self, which really, let me actually get to self as contact last. I'm going to go to values. So values is behaving in alignment, again, with the person's values and looking at how, and then committed action is looking at how those values are motivating behavior change, right? So this idea of values is sort of determining our values, and our actions are in alignment with those values. And committed action is more intentional action guided by values and rooted in intention and mindfulness. The last thing I want to talk about is self as context, and I wanted to talk about this last because this is another more kind of I don't want to call it difficult because it's I feel like that's giving it kind of like a negative vibe. But it is, I will say for me personally, this was also something that was kind of hard to understand. So self as context is essentially observing your transcendent self, which is the self that experiences the thoughts, behaviors, but is separate and not defined by them. So it is kind of similar to cognitive diffusion in the sense of it's kind of like this outer space kind of view of it in terms of the transcendent self is separate and looking down and viewing the thoughts and the behaviors. Okay. And the transcendent self is not defined by the thoughts, the behaviors, the feelings, the sensations, et cetera, et cetera. When considering self as context, language is really important. And we'll see that a little bit more when we get into the activities that I'm going to show you related to self as context. And the other aspect of self as context is the concept that attachment to the conceptualized self influences our behavior. So by separating ourselves from how we think and view ourselves, we are able to act differently depending on the situation or the perspective. So these are the components of psychological flexibility. And I'm going to shift into talking about techniques that you can try for yourself or try with any of the individuals that you're working with. But before we do that, I just want to ask, are there any questions about psychological inflexibility, about psychological flexibility? Any questions at all? That's a good question, Alyssa. So if you're not looking at the chat, Alyssa asked, how can we help someone understand that self as context is not dissociation? Um, so when we're kind of, that's hard, because when some folks dissociate, they know that they are dissociating. So I would say that so in general, ACT is intentional. ACT is about intentional action. Dissociation, we can't bring upon dissociation, right? It's something that is happening to us. So self as context is something that we are intentionally doing to ensure that we are separating ourselves from our thoughts and our behaviors and that we're not defining ourselves by them. Yes, I would say yes, Alyssa. And Christy also brought in this concept is moving towards self by observing thoughts and feelings, but not over identifying with them. So we understand that they're happening, but we're not, again, as Christy said, defining ourselves by them. So I think the best example I can make is, let's say you make a mistake. Exactly, Michelle, right? We're not giving them power over us. So let's say you made a mistake and let's say you lost $5 cash, $5 bill from your wallet, right? We might have that thought that we're stupid, that we're incompetent, that we're incapable, that we're not good at managing our money, and we're all these negative things, right? But in looking at this concept of self as context, we're separating our perspective on this situation. So we're understanding that this situation happened. We're accepting that this situation happened. We're accepting the potential consequences of this situation. But we are not defining ourselves by this one thing that happened, right? We are not incompetent. We are not incapable because we lost this money. We just lost this money. And to Christy's point, we are not our thoughts. We are not defined by them. I
Emily,
hope that. Mhm.
I
Go
just
on.
wanted to jump in also, and I
Yeah.
think, I loved your explanation of, intentional versus unintentional in terms of the comparison to dissociation. And also the dissociation in a lot of ways has a lot of physiological components to it, right? That the person's senses may be overwhelmed and the emotional pain that they're feeling by their thoughts may be overwhelmed. And so there is this, element of detachment from reality as well, because the current reality is too overwhelming. Yeah.
Thank you, Dawn. So I hope that clarifies, Alyssa. And I appreciate Michelle and Christy for chiming in as well. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Yes, Kelly, the slides will be shared along with the recording. And the PDF, so as I get into our slides, you'll see that once you get the PDF, you'll be able to click on all of these because I will very quickly share my screen again. So this is Stephen Hayes' website. And if you go to tools on his website, you will see all of these tools. They're all free. They're all divided by which, aspect of psychological flexibility you want to focus on. But you essentially click on the link and it brings you to the PDF. So what I essentially did on my PowerPoint is I highlighted the tools that I thought might be the most useful or kind of applicable, ones that I could kind of come up with examples that I think are applicable to supportive housing, but you could use any of these tools essentially. So the first section of tools are going to be diffusion techniques. And again, when we're thinking of diffusion, we're thinking about this idea that our thoughts are viewed as separate, and we're viewing our thoughts as an internal phenomena and behavioral process as opposed to the truth. Okay, so the first technique is sing it. And I really like this technique. I think it is super silly, and I think that is really the point of this technique. So in this technique, you're essentially taking a thought that you're having and you're singing it to a song like Happy Birthday. And the purpose of the exercise is not to make the thought unbelievable, but it's to separate the thought so you're able to view it as a thought. So when you think of like listening to music and listening to a song, um, we're not taking the information from the song as truth. right? We're just listening to it, we're hearing, maybe we're digesting, maybe we're processing, maybe it's making us think a little bit more depending on, what exactly the song is that we're listening to. But we're not taking it as that truth, right? So, but by taking whatever thought it is that you're having and singing it to a song, we're able to separate that thought to sort of outside of us and view it as something separate from us. So I think for example, I'm going to sing for all of you. My apologies in advance, right? But let's say the person, and yes, Michelle, everything on the website is free. Which I love, because again, I'm telling you, Stephen Hayes, he really wants to get ACT out there, which I think is awesome. But we're thinking about this technique, right? Let's say the thought is, I'm stupid or I'm really stupid, right? And if I were to sing that to the key of Happy Birthday, I'm really stupid. I'm really stupid. I'm really stupid. I'm really stupid. One, in saying that kind of sounds absurd to me. But also, it's like, it kind of gives this sense of like, this isn't me, right? It's this sense of this is just something I'm singing. It's not who I am and who I am as a person, right? So it's helping to kind of get that thought outside of us. And then Michelle, I think you also bring a great point, right? Music can be really great therapy for a lot of people. You said, I think that is great as our minds, when they are overwhelmed, are like a bomb needing to be diffused before we explode and our lives implode, right? Music is some of the greatest therapy. Yeah, it really can be. And again, it's helping us to separate ourselves from this thought. We are not the thing that we're thinking. The next thing that you can do for diffusion is give your mind a name. So in this technique, you name your mind to help you separate your mind and your thoughts from yourself. In naming your mind, you can view your thoughts in a similar way that you might view the opinion of a friend or family member. And it gives you the opportunity to be able to agree or disagree. So in giving my mind a name, I might give my mind the name Shelby. And essentially, when I have those thoughts that I'm stupid, that I'm incapable, that I'm doing the wrong thing, this is now Shelby talking to me, not myself. And it is giving me the control back to be able to be like, listen, Shelby, I don't really agree with you. You might have a point that I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I am who I am. So I'm going to disagree with you. Right. So you're giving yourself the ability to be able to, I don't want to say stop the thoughts, because I think we all know that, for a lot of people, it's easier said than done. But I think it can give us a little bit of that control back, because I think for a lot of people who experience a lot of negative self-talk, it can feel very overwhelming, like Michelle said. So I think being able to separate sort of that voice, that mean voice that is saying those negative thoughts in our head, even though we know it's us, by kind of separating that out to a different person, to giving it a different name. Maybe you're going to give it your middle name, right? So that it still has a little bit of a connection to you. So maybe it doesn't feel so uncomfortable. But by giving your mind a name, right, you're kind of giving yourself that power back. And then just to kind of clarify, these types of techniques, again, are going to work really well for any folks that you're working with that are experiencing a lot of negative self-talk. So any person that you're working with that is maybe either you're hearing from them, maybe verbally, you're meeting with them and you're hearing a lot of negative self-talk, or maybe it's kind of come up in the past. Maybe you've done some assessments and you've heard some negative self-talk. Maybe it's something that's being reported to you by another provider, but these techniques are going to be really good for those folks. Does anybody have any questions, any comments about diffusion techniques? Has anybody ever heard of these techniques before? Thank you, Kelly. Cool. So if it's new information and it's good information, I think that's great. The other thing I will say is you have the authority to figure out which techniques are going to work or not work for whomever it is you're working with. For example, you might have someone who you're working with who maybe has experienced some trauma, and maybe some verbal abuse. So maybe giving their mind a name is something that's not going to be helpful for them. Then you don't want to use that technique with them. Or maybe they've had that same experience, but they feel like giving their mind a name might help them to, again, take some of that power back, because maybe it's not their mom or their ex that's, their that voice that they're hearing anymore. Maybe giving it a different name would be helpful for them, right? So it's really up to you to figure out what may or may not work. So Michelle, you said you have, but this is similar talk that people learn in recovery, but didn't know there was a name for it. Yeah. And I would also wager that some of these techniques might sound a little bit similar to maybe techniques within CBT or DBT as well, because again, there is some overlap there. All right, let's move on to acceptance techniques. So again, oh, thank you, Lindy. So I don't have any specific ones to recommend. I will shift for a second just because it sounds like you might be hopping off in a little bit. But going back really quick to Stephen Hayes. So he has his own podcast. Oh no. So these are all of his podcast appearances. So again, as I said, he has been talking about ACT on podcasts since 2019. The one that I specifically listened to was in 2021, and it was the Wellness Paradox. Oh, no, it was Being Well, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy with Dr. Stephen Hayes. So this was the one that I listened to specifically, but these are all the different podcasts you can find, and you can click on the links, because again, he loves to talk about this. He talked about it all through 2024. He's even already talked about it in 2025. So I very much would recommend just going to the website and just going to his podcast, because get it from the source. I mean, I think that's one of the other really great things is that Dr. Stephen Hayes is still here and he's still happy to talk about it. And if you're gonna listen to anybody about ACT, you should probably listen to the person who created it. So to your point, Michelle, just giving people options and letting them use whatever they think will work for them, I think it's important in supportive housing that we let them choose. Absolutely. And one of the things I really like about the techniques that he has on his website is there are 3 for each aspect of psychological flexibility. So there's a couple there. And then at the same time, there are so many ACT self-help books out there. So his main book is The Liberated Mind, and that's more kind of textbooky / novelty. But there are just self-help books related to ACT that have very similar techniques, all from this theory and concept of ACT. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, essentially, just kind of what's free and accessible to all of you. The other thing I'll say is if you go to his website, he also has like a free like mini training on ACT that you also might be And yeah, there are workbooks out there, Christy. All right. So in looking at, I was just thinking that integrating mindful self-compassion interventions and soothing, caring, self-talk could be integrated for trauma clients when having challenges with negativity or acceptance. I would say potentially, Christy. I will say I am not as well versed on ACT as in other topics that I've presented on in the past, but I can imagine that bringing in some of those self-compassion interventions, right? That grounding, being in the moment, incorporating that mindfulness, I think that's very much in alignment with ACT and the mindfulness aspect of it. So in getting to acceptance, when we're thinking about acceptance, we're focusing on this idea of actively embracing thoughts, feelings, and sensations, even if they are uncomfortable. So the technique that I highlighted is something called the impossible game. And I thought that this technique was pretty interesting. So essentially, in the impossible game, you're trying to do the impossible by taking action, even if you are experiencing uncomfortable feelings or negative self-talk. So I think this is very much in alignment kind of with that goalie. I think a good example we could use is the goalie from the psychological flexibility video, right? So the goalie is going to play the impossible game and he's going to take that hit, even though he knows it's going to hurt, even though he's kind of uncomfortable with maybe taking that hit, he's going to play the impossible game. So essentially, what you're going to do is in the impossible game, you're trying to sort of hone this skill of what he describes as acceptance muscles. So essentially, you're flexing your muscle around acceptance. So you want to practice the skill in order to get more comfortable with with whatever uncomfortable feelings you might have that you need to kind of accept. So when you're thinking about the impossible game, we're going to essentially do the impossible. Okay. The point of the impossible game is to do the thing, even though you don't want to do the thing. And essentially, talking yourself into it to motivate yourself in order to play the game. So the game is really simple. It's literally just doing the impossible thing. You're kind of labeling it as this impossible thing, and you are then participating in it. And I just want to, 1 second, make sure I am not missing anything from the game. So no, I'm not. So can everybody see this? I just want to make sure. So this is the handout specifically for the impossible game. So Trina, when you go to the PowerPoint, it's linked on the PowerPoint. Oh, you guys don't see it. Okay. Hold on 1 second. There we go. You guys should be able to see it now. So to kind of give you a good example, I think it might be helpful to pull this up. So you wake up early in the morning, you feel drowsy, and you just want to hit the snooze button and go back to sleep. But instead, you play the impossible game and challenge yourself to get out of bed as fast as possible. You enjoy a hot shower and already dread the moment you have to get out, so you play the impossible game and challenge yourself to turn the shower all the way to cold. You're about to get to lunch and crave the chocolate chip muffin you have been eyeing ever since you entered the cafe. Instead of buying it, however, you challenge yourself to order an apple. So the impossible game is essentially you challenging yourself to do the other thing or to do the opposite thing. So in the morning, it's snoozing. So you're, again, being intentional and you're telling yourself, I'm not going to hit the snooze button. I'm just going to get out of bed and I'm going to do it as quickly as possible. For the last example, right? So you want to binge Netflix, which I think we all want to do at some point, right? But you're telling yourself in a very intentional way, I am not going to do that. I'm going to challenge myself to read 5 pages from this book. Does the impossible game as a technique kind of make sense? Does it make sense? Cool. So I want to challenge you all a little bit. Oh, yes, Kelly, what is your question? Well, it's funny you mentioned that, Kelly, because that's something I actually wanted to talk about. So I'm going to give you all an example. Um, so let's say you go to meet with a client to work on their goal around ADLs, specifically cleaning. And when you get there, you notice that they need to take out the garbage and they mention that they need to wipe down their counters and wash dishes also. How would you introduce the game to somebody that you're working with? Because I think you bring up a really good point, Kelly. I think that um, even though we might think it might be fun to play this type of quote unquote game, I could definitely see some of the individuals that we're working with being like, absolutely not. So how might you introduce this game to somebody that you're working with? I have an idea of how I would do it, but I let's help each other out, right? How might somebody out there do it? So Arya, you said set a timer and make it a race. I like that idea. Christy, you said, are you open to playing a game with me? I think that could be a really good opener and kind of like interesting. Like, well, what do you mean game, Christy? What are you talking about? I think that would get me a little interested. Alyssa, you said make it silly, see if they can do it with their opposite hand, upside down, in a funny, creative new way. Absolutely. Anybody else? I like that, Casey. I have something that has worked for me. Would you like to try it? I love that. And then just to kind of add to the mold, something you could also do is kind of lean to the person's interests. So for example, if somebody is interested in music, yes, Arya, right? You can play some music and sing along or dance as you clean. It could even be something as like putting on the person's favorite song and saying, hey, let's listen to one song and see how much we can get done. And then seeing what happens with that one song, and maybe something will happen afterwards. Maybe it's a podcast, right? Maybe someone's interested in podcasts. So maybe it's listening to a podcast and, cleaning or participating in a task. I think, if somebody is maybe like feeling like a little low in energy, doing something that could kind of give them energy, I think could really be helpful. And yes, Christy, absolutely, right? Also asking how they might feel in relation to their chosen values if they do the thing. How might they feel if they don't do the thing, right? And I think kind of bringing it back to the person's values and highlighting them and sort of weighing those options or kind of weighing that, I think could also be a really good technique because, again, our values are what is motivating us, right? Our values is what is going to help us to act and participate in intentional action. So I think kind of reorienting to that can be really helpful. And then, yeah, Christy, I'm not going to sing that, but I like that. I hear it in my head. This is hard to do. I don't want to do it. Here I am doing it. La, 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 la. Absolutely. And yes, Christy W, since I'm talking to two Christies now. Yeah, I mean, we all have things we don't want to do, right? So I think it kind of just depends on what we want to play to. And again, there's context, right? What's the person dealing with? You know, maybe if the person is feeling overwhelmed, maybe they feel like it's too much, then maybe we do mindfulness, right? Maybe we go to a grounding technique or we go to do something with the five senses. Maybe we do a short meditation and then go into the cleaning, right? So really figuring out sort of what the inhibitor, I'll call it, is, and then going from there. But these are all really, really great suggestions. This was good. Thank you, guys. So I want to move along a little bit because we have a couple more techniques and I want to make sure we get through them. So in terms of contact with the present moment, again, this is very much related to mindfulness, being in the here and now and being present in the here and now. So there's two techniques. So one is simple, just doing a simple meditation. So in this technique, obviously you're going to participate in a meditation. You might sit down, have your back straight, eyes slightly open, cast your eyes downward at a 45-degree angle and maintain a soft focus. There are so many guided meditations on YouTube now that you can listen to. There's nature meditations if you live by a source of water. There's like beachy kind of meditations that you could listen to, even if you're just kind of at a lake setting. And then it's also this technique called move in slow motion. So in this technique, you're going to pick an activity and you're going to complete it at half the speed. And while using this technique, you might find yourself feeling frustrated or wanting or thinking about moving faster. But that's okay because in noticing the thoughts and continuing with the exercise, you're actively practicing diffusion and acceptance. So this activity is kind of hitting a couple of different areas. You're being present in the moment, but you're also, again, strengthening that acceptance muscle and also kind of practice strengthening that diffusion muscle as well, because you're going to be noticing those thoughts that you're having and kind of accepting them and moving on from them. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend doing move in slow motion with like a task like cleaning, because I could understand that just being really frustrating. But maybe it's something like brushing your teeth. Or maybe it's something like brushing your hair. Or maybe it's something like getting dressed. Or if you can afford the water bill, maybe it's something like taking a shower and really taking your time. Yes, exactly. Putting lotion on. Maybe not blow drying your hair, but maybe like braiding your hair or just, brushing your hair, like I said. Maybe giving yourself a little bit of a facial. But yes, anything I think related to self-care could be really good as well. Or maybe it's coloring or painting or doing a creative type of task. But again, I would try not to do something that's kind of like not something we want to do to begin with. So in terms of self as context, what you're doing, and again, in considering self as context, we're thinking about observing our transcendent self, which is the self that experiences the thoughts and behaviors, but is separate and not defined by them. So in this technique, the purpose is to open your mind to possibilities. And you're going to start out with this idea of I am. So in this technique, you're going to finish the first two sentences with a personal attribute that you have. And then in the final sentence, you're going to end the sentence with a personal attribute you fear you might have. The exercise continues by questioning each of the attributes. Are you these attributes all the time? Can you make comparisons? What happens to the context if you add or not to the end of the sentence? So if we were to do this in practice, I might say, I am confident. I might say, I am educated. And I might say, I am mean. So once I have those three things, once I have those three, then, oh, I went too far ahead. Then I would go back to the first one and ask myself, am I confident all the time? No. Am I educated all the time? Kind of. That might be something you can kind of take away from me, though I feel like in the past I maybe said some things. I think like I'm educated in the things that I'm educated on, but there's also a lot I'm not educated on, right? Um, am I mean? I guess in times in the past I have been mean, but I'm not, a mean person all the time. Can I make comparisons? And then what happens to the context of that if I add or not to the end of the sentence, right? So this technique is really just helping the person to learn a little bit more about themselves, and sort of confronting uh, some of those negative perceptions that we have about ourselves. Again, to help us to separate ourselves from these thoughts and understanding that we're not defined by these things. So even though I've been mean at certain times in my life, I am not a mean human being. I am not a mean person. In the same way that even though there's been many instances where I've been a very confidently educated person, there are instances where I have not been as confident and maybe I have not presented myself as an educated human being. So before I get into the final two techniques, I do just want to check in if anybody has any questions. Okay. So in terms of values, this technique is writing your story. And in this technique, you're going to imagine that the next year of your life will be a pivotal year, and the next year will help you to define who you are. And what you're going to do is you're going to think about if you were to become more fully you during this year, what would that look like? What are areas of your life do you wish to grow in? What kind of person do you wish to be? And if you were writing the chapter of the next year of your life, what would the theme be? What I think is really cool about this is it's the beginning of the new year, essentially. I think even though we're in the second month of the year, we're still pretty much in the beginning. So I think this could be something really cool. And then essentially what you would do is do 10 minutes of writing about the next year and what you hope to become. Now, you might have someone that you're working with that isn't a writer and maybe doesn't want to write. I think Stephen, Dr. Hayes, I'm calling him Stephen like I'm, his friend. I think Dr. Hayes really focuses on the writing aspect of this. But I do wonder if someone could get as much benefit if maybe they were just talking about it. I think the writing piece of it is so that you have it and you can keep it and then you can kind of go back and reflect. But I also wonder if the person has a phone where they can record, if maybe talking about these things and then recording it and keeping that recording could also be just as effective as if one were to write it out and then go back and, at the end of the year and take a look at it. But again, if you're working with someone who maybe doesn't like to write, isn't a fan of writing, this probably wouldn't work. But if you have someone who really likes to write, does journal prompts, this would be really good for them. Is there a handout that corresponds with the exercise to rewrite your story? Yes. So once you get the PDF, you just have to click here where it says writing your story. Additionally, it is all of the handouts are on the website, and I'll show you guys that again after this last one. So the final one is committed action techniques. So again, when we're thinking about committed action, it's action guided by values and rooted in intention and mindfulness. So the first one is work new habits into established routines. So in this technique, you're anchoring a new habit to an already established one. So for example, you're working with a consumer who is interested in increasing their physical activity. To work a new habit into their routine, maybe they perform low impact exercises while watching TV, right? They're already watching whatever television show at 8 o'clock or 5 o'clock, or maybe they're watching Jeopardy, or maybe they're watching a soap opera in the middle of the day. So what they're going to do is they're going to pair that low impact exercise with watching that television show. In terms of making small adjustments, in this technique, you're making a commitment to make a small change. So again, for example, you're working with a consumer who wants to save money. To make a small adjustment, when their social security check comes in, they immediately withdraw $5 that they then save in an envelope. Okay, so it's a small adjustment. We're making really, really small baby steps. Another example of this might be, let's say that the person is maybe the person wants to, positively impact other people, or maybe wants to be more social. So maybe they compliment one person a month intentionally, at their partial credit program, or maybe just somebody in the community, maybe at the store, right? But again, this is an intentional thing that is going to be in alignment with what the person's values are. So if they're valuing kindness, maybe that's why they're going to compliment somebody in the community. So just to reiterate again, all of these techniques are linked in the PowerPoint. Dawn put the evaluation in the chat. I do want to ask that you fill out the evaluation if you can, because we love to hear your feedback. It's really, really important to us. So I do want to highlight that. These are two ACT books. Oh my God, it's two ACT books, excuse me. So the first one is Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, again by Stephen Hayes, and Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, second edition. And then again, I have also linked here his website. And I am just going to go back to his website for a second, because he has a lot of really, really great information on his website. So again, if you go to tools, all of the tools are here that I highlighted, as well as the ones I noted on the slides that I did not highlight. He also has them in Spanish. He also has ACT assessment tools. He has a newsletter if you're interested in signing up for his newsletter. He does have a store. He has different ACT classes that you can take. I do feel like there's a free one. He has different workshops that he's participating in. I thought oh, here we go. If you click see all here, he has all of his books here. And I'm not, honestly, Christy, I'm not sure about grief. I do wonder though if you um mindfulness and acceptance for addictive behaviors for children, diabetes, for chronic pain. Yeah, I don't see anything for grief here. But that's not just, these are just the books that he's authored. Um, I'm sure, I want to say with almost 100% certainty that other people have authored books on ACT, even if he hasn't been cited or hasn't authored them with this other person. So I would maybe just Google it and see if there is anything. Because there also aren't any, I don't think there's any workbooks here either. I think these are more just like theory kind of textbooks. And yeah, definitely take a look. And then again, his podcast. So he has all of his podcast appearances here on on a lot of different podcasts. So feel free to click on any of these links and listen to any of the podcasts because I think it's really cool that he loves talking about this and that he enjoys talking about it to make sure that people know about it and people can use it. So I'm gonna just go back to the PowerPoint really quickly because I know we're just about at time. So as I said, Dawn did put the evaluation in the chat. So please make sure that you do fill out the evaluation. We love your feedback. We need your feedback. We'd love to hear it. And I just want to thank everybody. Thank you all so much for your time and attention, participation, and engagement. I know it can be hard and difficult sometimes when we're in webinar mode because we can't see or hear you, but you guys are, as always, very engaged in the chat, and I appreciate that. But I do want to highlight again that today's webinar was hosted by DBHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority. I am just going to remind you again that the slides and a link to the recording of this session and a wealth of other resources will be available in the follow-up email. Don't forget to check out the Foundational Community Supports newsletter for all things FCS and any upcoming training events. I am going to stop the recording.